Antebellum Society. So really the big idea is we're looking at culture. We're looking at culture. And so we're going to look at like some different topics. We'll look at transcendentalism, what transcendentalism is, and then a couple of topics. We're going to look at utopian communities, a couple of topics, women's rights, a couple of topics, and at the end we'll just look at a handful of kind of miscellaneous topics here and there. So it's kind of culture before the Civil War. That's what we're looking at. All right. So first things first, let's talk about the word antebellum. So you might have heard of like Lady Antebellum, right, if you're into country music. But antebellum, in American history at least, refers to the era right before the Civil War. So if you're talking about the antebellum South, you might see some fancy ladies like that. And so in case you were wondering, antebellum is Latin for before the war. So when you're talking about antebellum America, you're talking about the era right before the Civil War. So this is culture right before the Civil War, in case you're wondering. All right. So once again, let's look at kind of one topic at a time. Big idea first. So big idea first. So the Second Great Awakening is a religious revival. You probably have heard of it already, right? And so remember, the Second Great Awakening is really going to spur a lot of reforms in antebellum America. And so like temperance, women's rights, abolitionism, all of these things are really going to be spurred on by the Second Great Awakening. So that's kind of the Holy Spirit's moving. Let's just say it that way. Praise the Lord. Let's move on. All right, so first kind of topic we'll look at is transcendentalism. I can almost guarantee you will learn about transcendentalism in depth in American literature class, but a big idea, kind of like generally what it is. It's something that's hard to put your finger on, but this is my attempt to define it. So it's a theological / philosophical movement. And this is mostly in New England, really kind of the heart of it's in Massachusetts, like I have written there, like Boston, Massachusetts is kind of the epicenter of it, really a Massachusetts thing, New England thing. All right, so this like philosophical, theological movement, if you're connecting it with Christianity, oftentimes you would connect it with Unitarians. So just as a side note, Unitarians, they're Christians, but they don't believe in the Trinity. We're not going to go there. But if you wanted to connect it with Christianity, Unitarians, Transcendentalists, they have a lot of overlap. Okay. So a Transcendentalist would believe you have a direct communication with God. They don't think you need any pastors or anything like that. No intermediary. I did not say that word right, but direct connection with God. They had a respect for nature. They were really about being self-sufficient, opposed to any sort of materialism. And so in popular culture, really I'd say like Little Women. So like the family of Little Women were Transcendentalists. They're part of the Transcendentalist movement. So that's probably maybe a connection you might have heard of before. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at two super famous authors connected with Transcendentalism. All right. So once again, we're the history folks here in American history. So we're not going to do deep dives into their writing. We're more or less going to say, hey, these people existed. Okay. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, the essay that we're going to connect with him at least is called Self-Reliance. And in this essay called Self-Reliance, it's all about nonconformity. So I always think of like how I remember nonconformity, connect that to Ralph Waldo Emerson is I think of like Where's Waldo? So Where's Waldo? He's kind of he has a whole style of his own. He kind of stands out a little bit in the crowd, although it's hard to find him sometimes. And so I think of like Where's Waldo? He's kind of his own unique individual. His style is pretty his own. And so I think of nonconformity and Waldo Emerson that way. Take it or leave it. All right. And so how are we connecting him to American history? Well, he is very much about encouraging Americans to stop just copying European culture and instead to try to create an entirely new American culture. He's saying, why are we copying what's happening in Europe? Why not just do our own thing? So he's really emphasizing nonconformity on a personal level, right, as a person, but also as a country. He's saying we have an opportunity here to be different. Why are we conforming to what we're seeing happening in Europe? All right. So Emerson has a friend, and Emerson's friend is, of course, Thoreau. So when I say friend, I just mean that like they are the two biggest names in transcendentalism, and they also knew each other, right? So Henry David Thoreau, there's going to be two things that I would connect with Thoreau. One, they're both writings, right? One is Walden, and the second one is Civil Disobedience. So once again, he's a transcendentalist. Both of these are obviously transcendentalists, and so they like nature. Good for you. Good for you. And so what he does is he goes and becomes this little hermit for a while, if you will. So he goes into Concord, Massachusetts, and gets this little cabin. In fact, there's the little cabin, and he lives by himself in the woods on Walden Pond for 2 years. So really to like disconnect from everything except for nature. And like he's spending no money. He's really living on his own. So he spends like $8 a year. So really kind of a hermit of the woods, if you will. Cool beard. If there was a hermit of the woods, I'd imagine he looked like that. Maybe without a bow tie, but you get the point. All right. And so he writes about his experiences connecting with nature, transcendentalist, 101 in the book Walden. And so here's a little quote. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts in life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discovered I had not lived. Deep, man. It's deep, deep. Okay, so that's one thing. And so he's really well known for this period of living in isolation in the woods. It's such a transcendentalist thing to do. It's ridiculous. Okay. Second thing is civil disobedience. So before there was Gandhi, trying to get India independent from Britain, before Martin Luther King Jr. is trying to get civil rights for African Americans in the United States, there was, of course, Henry David Thoreau. Oh. And so the idea is civil disobedience is how to change society using nonviolence. So like, for example, as we'll see in America, Martin Luther King Jr., they would never use violence, but they would break the law. So like they would integrate lunch counters. So African Americans weren't supposed to eat at this lunch counter. And so they would break the law, civil disobedience. They would disobey the law, but they would do it in a nonviolent way. And so Henry David Thoreau, 100 years before Martin Luther King Jr. was walking around, was advocating civil disobedience, nonviolence as a way to change the world. All right, so our transcendentalist authors, peace out, we got them down. Now, though, we're going to look at utopian communities, which are so fun to talk about because they're a little bit crazy. I like them. Here we go. So first things first, let's talk about words. So utopian communities, you have to know the word utopia. So you've probably heard of this before. So according to the internet, this is a definition of the word utopia. It's an imagined place or state of things in which everything is perfect. So if you're in your utopian world, everything would be perfect. And the word itself is funny, utopia, because it's actually Greek, which means not place or like not a place. So it's ideal. It's by very definition something that can't really exist in reality. So like, if I were to ask a student, in your utopian world, what would finals week look like? You would say, well, finals week, all finals would be open notes. There would be Starbucks available for free for all students the whole week long. You can choose to take a nap instead of taking a final. If you took the final, you would automatically get 100% regardless of how you studied. Like it'd be this ideal utopian world. It's no way connected to reality at all, but it's your kind of ideal world. And so let's talk about utopian communities first before we look at some specific things. So just kind of to understand. So remember, a lot of these utopian communities are going to be in New England. And remember, what's happening is cotton mills. Cotton mills are happening, right? And so we're starting to see the beginning of like the Industrial Revolution, at least the beginning rumblings of it in New England, right? And so there's going to be a little bit more urbanization, right? People living in cities, a little bit more industrialization. And this is a little bit of a reaction to that. People in utopian communities want to like step away from the real world, if you will. They want to escape kind of the rat race of the real world. So they're going to kind of take a step back and try to develop these ideal communities. Oftentimes these communities are based on farming, getting back to the land. And we'll see a series of these are connected with transcendentalists as well. So speaking of transcendentalist utopian communities, we're going to talk about Brook Farm. So Brook Farm's kind of like the OG utopian community. And this is just a whole bunch of transcendentalists living together on a farm. That's pretty much what it is. So Brook Farm, let's start at the beginning. George Ripley starts this farm. It's his idea. And he's a Unitarian minister and a transcendentalist. And so what's going to happen is this is just 9 miles outside of Boston. So what's happening is George Ripley is in this transcendentalist club. And they have all of these ideas, like they're intellectuals, and they're thinking of this ideal community. And so George Ripley's like, why don't we actually build this thing? So this is like transcendentalist Mecca, if you will, right? And so it's a farm. It's a 175-acre farm. And at its height, it had about 150 members. I didn't find an exact number, so somewhere between 100 and 150 members at its height. It's not going to last very long and only lasts about 6 years. They're going to get into debt, and then they have a bad fire, and it's going to be really hard. It's going to be a struggle to kind of rebuild after that. So it's a short-lived ideal experiment. There's some famous members of Brook Farm. So I don't know if Emerson lived there, but absolutely Emerson would visit. Nathaniel Hawthorne lived there for about 6 months. So the guy who wrote The Scarlet Letter. And really, it's the whole idea is like they'd work during the day, but at night they would have this intellectual life. So they'd have discussions, they'd have time to write. And so it was just kind of like manual labor during the day, working with your hands during the day. And then at night, it'd be the night would be like the intellectual life. It was a farm. So there were, like I said, there was absolutely farming going on. But they did have a school there as well. So a lot of the folks who were attracted to this were intellectuals. A lot of them were teachers. And so I think they had a boarding school there. I don't know if it's a boarding school, but they had a school there as well. And so once again, it's this like transcendentalist Mecca. They're like, why not form this like ideal community where you work during the day and have this like amazing intellectual life at night? All right, Brook Farm, transcendentalist community, peace out. All right, so here we go to what I think is one of the more interesting transcendentalist communities, and this is Oneida community. So once again, it's not necessarily connected with transcendentalism. This is separate, but it's a commune, right? So really what's important for the Oneida community is absolute equality. So social economic equality, men and women, little kids too, right? And so it's a commune, so they hold everything in common. So all the property was held in common. But what they were most criticized for, and probably most known for, was complex marriage. So they also shared sexual partners. And so in a sense, like among the adults, like all of the women in a sense were married to all of the men and vice versa. So it's like a free love sort of situation going on at the Oneida community. They did last surprisingly a long time. Brooks Farm was 6 years. Oneida community was 30. And really one of the reasons why they were able to last so long is because they were economically viable. What they were known for was producing very high quality silverware. And while the commune part, ended after 30 years, and here's a picture of the giant Oneida community. Anyway, The commune lasted 30 years, but the company is still around today. And so if you go to Target, for example, and you type in Oneida, you can still buy Oneida silverware at Target. And then this is obviously some of the silverware from like back in the day. But there, like I said, there are many different examples of transcendental, of utopian communities. The Shakers, we're not going to talk about them, but like I said, there's lots of different ones. I just showed you a couple of them. So if you want to Google something interesting, you can go ahead and do that. All right. Moving on then, we're looking at women's rights. So women's rights, so just to kind of introduce a couple of things here. So when you're talking about feminist movement, there's been many different waves of the feminist movement. Some say there are 3 waves. Some say there are 4 waves. Some say there have been 5 waves of the feminist movement. But we're not going to go there. We're going to go to the very beginning. So when we're talking about the very beginning of like America's feminist movement, you're going to be talking about these lovely ladies right here. So this is Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so these are the original women's rights advocates. Yeah, we kind of talked about Abigail Adams before, but when we're talking about the beginning of the women's rights movements, kind of the first wave of feminism, you're talking about these ladies right here. And what they want more than anything else is the right to vote. The right to vote. That's really the original women's rights movement, the first wave of feminism. That's what they're trying to get, the right to vote. Suffrage. Suffragettes, if you will. And just as a heads up, women won't get the right to vote in the United States till 1920, and that'll come about with the 19th Amendment. So just saying, they're not going to get the right to vote, but they're going to start the movement that leads to women getting the right to vote. So we'll look at these different waves of feminism as history progresses, but the suffrage movement, the first wave of feminism, you can pinpoint it to these 2 ladies right here. All right, so let's look at them. Let's talk about them. Good idea. All right, so Elizabeth Cady Stanton is a mother of 7, so she was a busy lady. She is the president of the National Women's Suffrage Movement. And with that, remember, suffrage is the right to vote. So National Women's Suffrage Movement. Pretty self-explanatory. We'll talk about the Seneca Falls Convention in just a little bit, but just for now, just realize she organizes it, and it's the first women's rights convention, so she's really connected with organizing that. And we're going to see, like I said, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they were really a duo. They were a tag team. They were in it to win it together. And so each of them will bring a certain strength. So Stanton was really, she excelled at the ideas, she excelled at the rhetoric. So she was really great at the idea part, at the rhetoric part of the women's rights movement at the beginning. And like I said, these 2 ladies couldn't be more different, right? Stanton was a married mother of 7, and she came from a very wealthy background, and she liked fancy clothes. She liked nice food, okay? So just so you can see, these ladies are going to be very different, but they work together beautifully. All right, so that is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And then you can't talk about Stanton without talking about Susan B. Anthony, Aunt Susan, as she was called. All right, so she's very different than Stanton. So she never married, never had kids. And she was a Quaker. And remember, Quakers are very about living this very simple life. So she couldn't look more different in personality and temperament, in dress, in family choices than Stanton. So they're very, very different. And I should mention this, she is an abolitionist as well. But really, when we're talking about antebellum America, like a lot of the reformers, they were involved in many different movements. So a lot of the people in women's rights movement were also leaders in the abolitionist movement to get rid of slavery. People who were trying to get rid of slavery were also part of the temperance movement that was trying to get rid of alcohol. And so a lot of the reformers had kind of irons in many fires. So just kind of keep that in mind. There's a lot of overlap. Anyway, so Susan B. Anthony, what did she excel at? She really excelled at organization. She was the boots on the ground. Stanton was pretty well put. She had to stay put. She had 7 kids to raise. So Stanton really wasn't able to travel around much. But Anthony, she was the one who would actually take these ideas these ladies came up with together, and she would travel around the country delivering speeches. And once again, the right to vote was really what they were after. There were a lot of things they would want to change. They want to change laws regarding, different educational opportunities, different opportunities for jobs, different opportunities for women to have rights legally. There was a lot of things they'd want to change, but what they really knew is suffrage was the key. That if women got the right to vote, then they could use that to change the other things that they saw as grievances against women in society. Dropped my pen. So suffrage was really the key. They said if we could get the right to vote, then once we got some political influence, then we can change all of these other things we'd like to fix. Okay. Praise the Lord. All right. So like I said, we're going to go back then to talk about Stanton for just a second. Oh, I forgot this. Oh, we'll look at this first. Sorry. All right. So Susan B. Anthony. So if you had to point to a woman who really, really worked her entire life to get women the right to vote, you're going to talk about Susan B. Anthony. And so every year, she is buried, I think, in Syracuse, New York. Somewhere in New York. Every year, not every year, but every time there's an election season, oftentimes women will line up for their chance to place the I voted sticker on Susan B. Anthony's tomb, because she really is connected with the woman who really spent her whole life working to get women the right to vote. Okay, so like I said, we're going back to talk about Stanton for just a little bit, because Stanton, of course, is one of the couple of women who really organized the first women's rights convention, which was the Seneca Falls Convention. So Seneca Falls Convention is the first women's rights convention in the U.S. And it's aptly named Seneca Falls Convention because it was in Seneca Falls, New York, right? It is fairly close to where Stanton lived. And the document you absolutely have to connect with the Seneca Falls Convention is the Declaration of Sentiments. Sometimes it's called the Declarations of Rights and Sentiments, but more often than not, I just hear it called the Declaration of Sentiments. And so the Declaration of Sentiments is the document that they produce as this convention. And what it is it mimics the structure of the Declaration of Independence. So, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. Well, the Declaration of Sentiments says all men and women are created equal. The Declaration of Independence has a list of complaints they have against King George and the Parliament. The Declaration of Sentiments has a list of grievances and complaints they have regarding women's rights, things that are happening they don't want to have happen, things that aren't happening that they want to have happen. So just kind of a list of grievances, things they want to see changed. Right. And so once again, this is the launching pad of the first wave of feminism. This is where you can, poke your finger out. Where does the women's rights movement start? Well, it starts at the Seneca Falls Convention with the Declaration of Sentiments. All right. So moving on, the next thing we're going to look at is just kind of some miscellaneous things. So these folks don't really belong in like the women's rights movement or anything like that. So Dorothea Dix, she is known for being an advocate for the mentally ill. So before the insane, which is their word, right? The insane weren't really understood well. They weren't really seen as being mentally ill. So oftentimes they would be in prison, they'd be in poorhouses, they'd be in insane asylums, and they really weren't treated humanely. They really weren't seen as being mentally ill. Like they were seen as being insane, demonic possessed perhaps, right? They really weren't understood. And so what she did is she would visit these prisons and poorhouses and insane asylums and get a firsthand view of really what was happening. And then she would take her firsthand accounts and she would write letters to politicians. She would get up in front of legislatures, if possible, which is a very unique thing for a woman to do, and to really speak on behalf of the mentally ill and explain really the situation. So really trying to draw attention to the way the mentally ill were treated. All right, so that's really what she's known for. But of course, we're right before the Civil War, so you can't not talk about this fact because it's a pretty cool fact. But also, besides her work with the mentally ill, she's going to be kind of the head nurse or the superintendent of nurses for the Northern Army, for the Union Army in the Civil War. So a little shout out to her Civil War service as well. Okay, moving on. All right, Horace Mann. That is a fun name. It sounds like horseman, but it's Horace Man. So he is the school guy. So the common school movement is the idea that you use local taxes to fund basic education for children. So kind of the beginning of the public school system. And he is going to be doing this in his home state of Massachusetts. So he really spearheads the common school movement in Massachusetts, really organizes it, sets it up in Massachusetts. And then from there, he uses that kind of structure to spread it to other states. So he kind of sets up an example in Massachusetts, and then from there, it'll spread to other states. So like the beginnings of public schools. But once again, this is just very basic free public education for children. Fun fact, so if you've ever been to Iowa City, there's a Catholic bookstore there called the Mustard Seed, and right across the street from the Mustard Seed is an elementary school which is named Horace Man. And last time I was at the Mustard Seed, I got super excited because it was the first time I noticed the name of the school. And I'm like, it's like American history in an elementary school. Isn't that? Well, I thought that was special. Moving on. We're almost done. Praise the Lord. Here we go. American Temperance Society. So temperance, they're talking about alcohol, right? So what they want to do is they want to have people take a pledge to stop drinking alcohol. So the American Temperance Society grew very quickly. So in the first 5 years, they had 170,000 members. So in the first 5 years, 170,000 members. That's not bad. And really what they're trying to do, this specific society, is get people to sign a pledge that they would stop drinking alcohol. That was really their shtick. That was their thing. Getting people to sign these temperance pledges that they would promise to stop drinking alcohol. So for example, this is one. This is the Family Temperance Pledge. And it reads, "We agree with each other that we will not buy, sell, or use intoxicating liquors as a beverage, and will use our best endeavors to curtail and prevent the sale and use of the same by others." And so once again, they want you to sign this pledge saying you're not going to drink alcohol. Here's some ladies saying, "Lips that touch alcohol shall not touch ours." So once again, that's really their shtick. It's having a pledge to abstain from drinking alcoholic beverages. All right, last but not least, we have some art. So the Hudson River School. So first things first, to realize this is not a physical building. This is not like a university. It's not a school in this sense, but rather it is a group of painters. So it's like a type of art, okay? A genre of art, perhaps you would say. So the Hudson River School is a group of American painters, and like the guy you would connect with him the most is Thomas Cole. So if you ever go to New York City, if you go to the Met, which is like their huge art museum in Central Park, there's a whole section that's just, the Hudson River School. They have a ton of Thomas Cole paintings. So next time in New York, forget the Statue of Liberty, go to the Met. That's what I say. Anyway, so it's called the Hudson River School because they really focused on landscapes, painting landscapes of the Hudson River Valley, but also of New England in general. So I'm going to throw up a map here quick. So just as a reminder, the Hudson River, there you go. The Hudson River Valley, kind of the Catskill Mountains over there. That was the landscapes they were painting. And really why it's important, why do they get a shout out? Well, it's really the first native school of painting in the United States. Because remember, before really the United States, we didn't have a hugely independent culture. We were copying a lot of things that we saw in Europe. A lot of things started in Europe and we kind of took and adapted them, whatever. But this is American. This is our river valley, dang it, and we're painting it. That's right. Try to paint the Hudson River Valley if you live in Spain. I say you cannot. All right, so we're just going to look at a couple of paintings here and then be good with it. Okay, there's Hudson River. Ooh, look at that lovely mountain. Wow, so beautiful. I know. Ah, look at the light. So pretty. So these are both Thomas Cole paintings there, in case you're wondering. All right, so let's kind of recap here and be done with it. So once again, Antebellum Society, what's going on in culture? Well, we're seeing a lot of reform movements thanks to the Second Great Awakening. And by the way, a huge part of this culture too is abolition. A huge part of the reform culture is trying to get rid of slavery. Abolitionists. So just as an FYI, we're going to take a whole little chunk. We'll have a whole separate lecture on the abolitionists. But abolitionists you could absolutely include in this discussion. So we kind of saw, once again, to review our transcendentalist with our authors there. Then we saw some utopian communities, the beginning of the first wave of feminism, and then just a handful of reformers and artists, that sort of thing.